I slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table. Abigail stared at them like they were written in some dead language. "Wade, what is this?" Her voice was quiet, like she already knew the answer but hoped I'd say something else. I took my time, lifting my coffee cup, letting the heat roll off it before taking a sip. "That's freedom, Abigail. You wanted it. You got it." She blinked, shoulders stiff, hands gripping the edge of the table like it might steady her. "This is a joke, right?" I leaned back in my chair, stretching out my legs. "Do I look like I'm laughing?" For a second, she just sat there, mouth slightly open like she had a dozen things she wanted to say but no idea which one to start with. I let the silence hang. She'd figure it out soon enough. She glanced at the papers again. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." She looked up at me then, searching for something in my face. Regret, maybe. Weakness. She wasn't going to find either. "I don't understand. When did you?" "Don't do that, Abigail. Don't play dumb. You know exactly when." Her throat worked like she was trying to swallow something too big. "Wade, listen, we can talk about this." I cut her off with a sharp shake of my head. "No, we can't. That's the part you don't get. There's nothing to talk about. You made your choice. I'm just making mine." She swallowed hard. "You don't even." "I do. I know everything." Her hands tightened around the papers. She didn't ask how I knew, didn't demand proof. Smart. She had to know I wouldn't come to the table empty-handed. I stood up, pushing my chair back slow, keeping my movements deliberate. No yelling, no slamming fists, no dramatic speeches. Just facts. "You got until the end of the month to move out." I picked up my coffee and took another sip, watching her over the rim. "I'll be civil. You want to take your stuff, go ahead. But this house? It's mine. The kids? They stay with me." That got her. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "Wade, you can't." "I can. And I did." I pulled another sheet of paper from my pocket and slid it across the table next to the divorce papers. "Custody agreement. Already filed." She snatched it up, scanning it, her breathing getting faster. "You had no right to." "I had every right. See, while you were off playing house with Devereaux, I was making sure my family wasn't getting screwed over." I nodded at the papers. "You'll get weekends." "That's generous, considering." Her mouth opened, then closed. She was thinking. She'd never seen me like this before. Not cold, not calculating. She was used to me being steady, maybe a little distant at times, but never like this. I didn't mean for." I let out a low breath, shaking my head. "Abigail, don't sit there and tell me you didn't mean anything. You knew exactly what you were doing every time you walked into his office. Every text, every late night, every lie. You meant all of it." She shrank back a little, but I didn't let up. "And don't you dare try to tell me it was my fault. That I was distant, that I was too busy, that I wasn't around. You know what I was doing? Working. Paying for this house, for those kids. For you. I was handling business and you were handling him." Her face crumpled for a second before she forced it blank again. She wasn't going to cry. Not in front of me. She stared down at the papers, jaw tight. "And that's it? You're just walking away?" I nodded once. "Yeah, that's it." The room went silent except for the ticking of the cheap wall clock above the stove. The one she always said she hated but never bothered to replace. I drained the last of my coffee and set the cup down with a quiet clink. "We're done here." She didn't move, didn't say a word. Just sat there, staring at the pile of paperwork like it might burst into flames if she looked hard enough. I turned and walked out, leaving her there in the kitchen with her choices. I stepped outside, letting the screen door slap shut behind me. The late afternoon air was thick with humidity, that kind of weight that made everything feel slower. I rolled my shoulders and took a long breath, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. Martha O'Neill was watching from her front porch, tucked under her usual knit shawl, rocking slow in her chair. She had that look on her face, the one old women get when they know things before anyone says them out loud. I nodded in her direction. "Afternoon, Martha." She nodded back, one bony hand resting on her cane. "'Bout time, Wade." I huffed a short laugh. You knew. Her lips pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Seen that car too many times parked down the block when you weren't home. Figured you'd handle it in your own time. She took a long pause, looking past me toward the house. She's still in there? Yeah. She gonna cause trouble? I shrugged. She can try. Martha made a sound in the back of her throat. Something between a chuckle and a cough. Ain't got the stomach for a real fight, that one. Just like the easy way out till it bit her in the backside. I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. I pulled my truck keys from my pocket and rolled them between my fingers. There wasn't much left to say. Abigail had her papers. She had her choices. She'd made them already, she just didn't like the consequences. I climbed into my truck, let the old engine rumble to life, and pulled out onto the road. I wasn't in a hurry. No need to be. I let the truck roll slow through town, windows down, taking in the sights like I hadn't seen them 1,000 times before. Downtown was busy enough for a Wednesday. The diner had a steady crowd, old-timers nursing their coffee, kids fresh out of school dragging their feet toward the gas station for candy and soda. The hardware store had its usual pickup trucks parked outside, a couple of guys loading lumber into the bed of one. Life moved on, same as it always did. I pulled into my usual spot outside Adam's Cafe, the kind of place that hadn't changed in 30 years. Inside, the air was thick with coffee and bacon grease, the hum of conversation filling the space. I slid onto my usual stool at the counter. Adam himself was at the grill, spatula in hand, flipping something that sizzled loud. He glanced over his shoulder. You look like a man who just finished a job. I smirked. Something like that. He nodded once and poured me a coffee without asking. That's why I liked Adam. No small talk, no sympathy, just coffee when you needed it. I was halfway through my cup when I heard the chair next to me scrape against the floor. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Sheriff Tom Brooks. Wade. Tom. He settled in, sighing like his whole damn job sat between his shoulders. Heard some chatter today. That right? I kept my eyes on my coffee, took another sip. Yeah. About you. About Abigail. I didn't answer. Let him talk. He drummed his fingers against the counter. Seems like half the town already knows about the papers. People talk. They do. Some people are wondering if there's gonna be trouble. I turned my head then, met his eyes. From me. He held my stare, then shook his head. Nah. Abigail, maybe? Devereaux, definitely. Man's got a reputation for getting nasty when things don't go his way. I let out a slow breath, set my cup down easy. Yeah. I figured as much. You got a plan? I smirked. Tom, when have I not? That got a short laugh out of him. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a toothpick, rolled it between his teeth. Just keep it legal, Wade. I tapped the side of my cup. Always do. He snorted but didn't push it. After he left, I finished my coffee, left a few bills on the counter, and stepped back outside. The sun was lower now, heat easing up just a little. Across the street, parked like it owned the place, was a sleek black BMW. Devereaux. He was leaning against the driver's side door, suit crisp, arms folded, sunglasses hiding his eyes. He wasn't trying to hide. He wanted me to see him. I smiled. A slow, knowing smile. This was going to be fun. I took my time stepping off the curb, making sure Devereaux saw the easy way I moved, the lack of urgency. The man liked to play chess, always thinking 3 moves ahead, but he wasn't the only one who knew the game. He straightened as I crossed the street, adjusting his cuffs like he was about to step into a courtroom. I stopped a few feet away, just close enough to make him uncomfortable, just far enough to make him wonder. Wade, he said, voice smooth, practiced. Probably spent years perfecting that tone, the one that made people think he was in control. Rick. I glanced at his car, then back at him. You lost. His mouth twitched, a shadow of a smirk. Just thought we should talk. I nodded. Yeah? Funny. I don't recall having anything to say to you. He let out a slow breath through his nose, like he was trying to keep things civil. I understand you're upset. That made me laugh. Upset? No, see, upset is finding out your dog chewed up your boots. Upset is realizing you forgot to pay the water bill. This is something else. He shifted his weight, tilting his head slightly. Wade, you need to understand, these things, they happen. People grow apart. Abigail needed someone who could provide, Careful, I cut in, voice low. You're stepping on thin ice, counselor. He paused, eyes searching my face, then smiled like he thought he had me figured out. I just don't want this to get messy. I let that hang for a second. Messy, I repeated, tasting the word. See, that's the thing, Rick. I don't mind messy. Never have. His smirk faltered. He wasn't expecting that. I took another step closer, watching how he stiffened just a little, just enough for me to see it. Now I get it. You think you've got it all worked out. You saw an opportunity, took it, and now you figure the hard part's over. But you made one mistake. His jaw tensed. And what's that? I smiled, but there wasn't anything friendly about it. You thought I'd roll over. I let that sink in before stepping back, giving him just enough space to breathe. Now, I suggest you take your little victory lap somewhere else. Because from here on out, every step you take, every little piece you try to move, I'm gonna be right there. And when this is over, you're not just gonna lose, Rick. You're gonna wish you never played. He swallowed, but his face stayed smooth. You think you can intimidate me? I shook my head. No. I think you're already intimidated. I turned without another word and walked back to my truck. I didn't have to look back to know he was still standing there, watching me go. He thought he was in control. That was his first mistake. His second was underestimating the man he'd just screwed over. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting, long shadows stretching over the lawn. The house was quiet. Abigail was still inside, probably pacing, trying to figure out her next move. Didn't matter. I had my own to make. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in a while. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Wade Nelson, the man on the other end, said, sounding amused. Hell, I figured you were either dead or retired. Neither, I said. Got a job for you. A pause. Then, go on. I looked toward the house, toward the woman inside who had spent the last year lying to my face. Toward the mess that was about to unfold. Need some dirt, I said. The kind that sticks. The voice on the other end chuckled. Well, now. That's my favorite kind. I leaned back in my seat, a slow grin forming. Good. Then let's get to work. A week later, the first domino fell. I was back at Adam's, same stool, same coffee, same steady hum of small-town life rolling on like it always did. The morning paper sat folded next to me, the front page carrying a little piece of gold. It wasn't much, just a quiet little story about a certain lawyer's firm being investigated for financial irregularities. Nothing concrete yet. Just enough to get people talking. Adam poured me a fresh cup, his eyes flicking to the paper. You see this? I didn't look up. What's that? He huffed. That's Snake Devereaux. Looks like he's got some explaining to do. I finally glanced at the article, turning the page like I was seeing it for the first time. Huh. Well, ain't that something? Adam eyed me, tapping his fingers on the counter. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? I took a slow sip of coffee. Now, Adam, why would you ask me a thing like that? He chuckled. Just a hunch. The door swung open, and like clockwork, in walked Devereaux. He wasn't wearing his usual smug look today. No, today he looked like a man with a fire burning under him. His suit was still crisp, tie still perfect, but there was tension in his shoulders, a tightness in his jaw. He scanned the room, eyes landing on me almost immediately. I smiled. Just a little. Just enough. He walked over, not even bothering with pleasantries. We need to talk. I leaned back on my stool. Do we? Now. Adam raised an eyebrow but didn't say a word. I slid off the stool, grabbed my coffee, and gestured toward the door. After you. Outside, the morning air was cool, the sun still low in the sky. Devereaux turned to me, voice low and tight. I don't know what the hell you think you're doing, but it stops now. I took a sip of coffee, let the silence stretch. What exactly do you think I'm doing, Rick? His eyes narrowed. I know you had something to do with that article. I smirked. Oh, you mean the one about your firm being investigated? That article. His jaw clenched. This is going to blow over. You think you can smear my name, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. I nodded, thoughtful. Maybe. Or maybe you don't know who you're dealing with. I took another slow sip, watching the way his nostrils flared. He was used to being in control, used to making people squirm. Not today. You want to play games? Fine, he said, voice dropping lower. But let's be clear, Wade. This doesn't end well for you. I chuckled, shaking my head. Rick, buddy, I ain't playing games. This is just business. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near growl. You think you're smart, but you don't have the power to bring me down. I shrugged. Don't need power. Just patience. And the right friends in the right places. His lips pressed into a tight line. He was starting to see it now, the shape of things, the cracks forming in the perfect little world he'd built. I leaned in just a little, keeping my voice level. See, you took something that wasn't yours. Thought you could get away with it. But you didn't check the foundation before you stepped in, did you? Now you're standing in quicksand, and the more you fight it, the faster you sink. His fingers twitched a tell. He was rattled. I smiled, taking one last sip of coffee before stepping back. Enjoy your morning, Rick. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, fists clenched, shoulders tight. The fun was just getting started. By that evening, the second domino fell. Abigail called. I let it ring twice before answering. Yeah? Wade, her voice was thin, uneasy. Can we talk? I didn't answer right away, just let the silence do the heavy lifting. Finally, I sighed. Talk about what, Abigail? She hesitated. I don't understand why you're doing this. I chuckled, shaking my head. Doing what, exactly? This. She let out a breath, frustration creeping in. You're trying to ruin him. I let out a low whistle. That right? Sounds like he's doing a fine job ruining himself. Wade, come on. No, you come on, Abigail, I cut in, voice hard. You made your bed. You picked him. You thought he was your golden ticket. But guess what? Turns out that ticket's got an expiration date. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, barely above a whisper, I didn't think you'd do this to me. That made me laugh, a short, sharp thing. To you? Abigail, I didn't do a damn thing to you. You did that all by yourself. Wade, please. Can't we just? I didn't let her finish. Nah. We can't. I let the words settle before hanging up. She wasn't calling because she cared. She was calling because she was scared. And she should be. By the next morning, the third domino fell. Devereaux's law firm issued a statement about the investigation. Official, rehearsed, trying to sound confident. But the cracks were widening. His business partner distanced himself, more whispers started spreading, and by noon, someone had leaked internal emails. Rick Devereaux was officially in damage control. I sat back on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood move like it always did. Martha O'Neill shuffled past, pausing at the steps. Looks like that lawyer friend of yours is having a rough week. I smiled. Yeah. And it's only Wednesday. She let out a slow chuckle. You be careful now, Wade. Cornered animals do stupid things. I tipped my mug toward her. Oh, I'm counting on it. Because the best part about a man like Devereaux? He was about to make his biggest mistake yet. I figured it wouldn't take long for Devereaux to lash out. A man like that, all polished edges and expensive suits, wasn't used to losing. He'd spent his whole life making sure the game was rigged in his favor, and now the board was tilting against him. I'd been waiting for his next move, and sure enough, he didn't disappoint. It was late, past midnight, when the sound of tires crunching over gravel caught my attention. I was sitting in my truck outside my office, finishing off the last dregs of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The car pulled up across the street, lights off, engine humming low. I let it sit there for a minute, watching. Then, just as I figured, the driver's side door opened and out stepped Devereaux. He wasn't in his usual suit this time. He traded the courtroom polish for something more casual, dark jeans, a leather jacket that probably cost more than my mortgage, and a look that said he wasn't here for legal negotiations. He walked with a purpose, his steps too quick, too eager, like a man who thought he was about to settle something once and for all. I didn't move as he approached. Just let him come to me. You've made your point, he said, voice tight, barely controlled. I arched an eyebrow. That right? Didn't realize I was making one? His jaw ticked. You need to stop this. Now. I let out a slow breath, tilting my head. Stop what, exactly? You know damn well what. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make him sweat. Then I leaned forward, resting my arms on the steering wheel. Thing is, Rick, I didn't do anything but shine a little light in dark places. Whatever's crawling out, that's on you. He took a step closer, too close, like he thought crowding my space would put me on edge. I just looked at him, unblinking, waiting for him to realize his mistake. You think you've won? He asked, voice dropping. You think dragging me through the mud changes anything? I smiled, slow and knowing. Oh, I know it does. His nostrils flared. You don't get it, do you? I don't lose. I finally shifted, letting my boot drop down from the dash, sitting up straight. Then what do you call this? His hand twitched. Not a full move, just enough for me to see the frustration bubbling under his carefully crafted mask. That was the thing about men like Devereaux. They were untouchable right up until the moment they weren't, and then they had no idea what to do with themselves. You want a war, Nelson? He finally said, voice low. I let out a short laugh. Rick, we've been at war. You just didn't notice till now. He held my gaze a second longer, then turned sharply, heading back toward his car. He yanked open the door, hesitated, then looked back at me. This isn't over. I gave him a slow nod. You're right about that. He got in, slammed the door, and peeled out, tires skidding against the pavement. I watched his taillights disappear into the night, then pulled out my phone and dialed. It rang twice before the voice on the other end answered. Yeah? It's time, I said simply. A low chuckle. Figured as much. I ended the call and leaned back in my seat, listening to the night settle around me. The next move wasn't mine anymore. I'd set the pieces in motion. Now all I had to do was wait. By the next morning, the storm had officially hit. I was back at Adam's watching the news on the old TV mounted in the corner. The sound was low, but I didn't need to hear it. The scrolling banner at the bottom of the screen said it all. Prominent local attorney under investigation, legal malpractice and fraud allegations surface. Adam refilled my coffee without asking. You see this? I nodded. I see it. He leaned on the counter, wiping his hands on a rag. Man like that figured he had skeletons. Just didn't think they'd come rattling out all at once. Yeah, well, I took a sip. Sometimes they just need a little push. Adam gave me a look, but he didn't ask. He knew better. By noon, the whispers had turned to full conversations. Devereaux's office was locked up tight, reporters sniffing around, people murmuring in hushed voices outside the courthouse. His business partner had already put out a statement distancing himself, claiming he had no knowledge of the fraud. It was textbook. The ship was sinking and the rats were jumping off. I parked a block away from Abigail's place. She was still in the house, at least for now. I knew she'd be watching the news, knew she was probably pacing, chewing her nails, wondering when the wreckage was going to hit her. She didn't see me walk up. I knocked once, hard enough to make her jump. When she opened the door, her eyes were tired, rimmed with red. She looked like she hadn't slept. Wade, she exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded toward the inside. We gonna do this at the door, or are you gonna let me in? She hesitated, then stepped back. I walked past her, looking around. The place was neat, too neat, like she'd been cleaning just to have something to do with her hands. Why are you here? She asked, closing the door behind me. I turned to face her. Just figured I'd check in. See how you were holding up. She swallowed. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I smiled, but there wasn't any warmth in it. No, Abigail. But I sure as hell ain't sorry either. She let out a shaky breath. I didn't know. I tilted my head. Didn't know what? About Rick. About any of this. I swear, Wade, I didn't. I held up a hand, stopping her. Don't. You knew enough. You knew the kind of man he was, and you still bet on him. Now you're realizing you backed the wrong horse. She flinched like I'd hit her, but I didn't let up. You made your choices, Abigail. And now you get to live with them. Same as me. She blinked fast, looking down, wrapping her arms around herself. So that's it. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my jaw. That's it. I turned toward the door, pausing with my hand on the knob. Good luck, Abigail. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out, shutting the door behind me. By the time I reached my truck, I felt lighter. It was almost over. Just one more piece left to fall. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward as Rick Devereaux pushed through the swarm, his jaw locked tight, his suit just a little less perfect than usual. He didn't stop to answer questions, didn't flash that practiced smile, just kept moving, his lawyer at his side, whispering fast and low. The confident, untouchable attorney was gone. In his place was a man fighting to keep his head above water. I stood across the street, hands in my pockets, watching the show. He knew I was there. His eyes flicked toward me once, quick, like a man checking his six in a fight. I gave him a slow nod, nothing more. He turned away fast, disappearing into the courthouse. Adam walked up next to me, coffee in hand, looking like he had all the time in the world. Hell of a mess, he muttered. That it is. Man goes from running the town to running for cover. He took a sip, smirking. Almost poetic. I nodded, watching as the last of the crowd funneled inside. He brought it on himself. Adam huffed. Ain't that the truth? By the time I made it back home, Abigail was already packed. A few suitcases by the door, nothing dramatic, just the bare essentials. She was standing in the living room, arms crossed, staring at the floor. When I walked in, she didn't look up right away, just took a slow breath. I'll be gone by tonight. I nodded, leaning against the doorframe. That's for the best. Her jaw tensed. You don't have to be so damn cold about it. I let out a short chuckle. Abigail, cold would have been throwing your stuff out on the lawn 2 weeks ago. This is just me making sure we're done clean. She let that sit for a moment, then finally lifted her eyes to mine. I don't know what you wanted me to say, Wade. I know I screwed up. I know I. Stop. I pushed off the frame, stepping closer. We're past all that. You made your choices and I made mine. Nothing else to say. She swallowed, nodding. And the kids. They stay with me like we agreed. Her lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't argue. We both knew there wasn't a fight to be had there. She'd lost any right to challenge it the moment she walked into Devereaux's office for something other than legal advice. She glanced toward the door, rubbing a hand over her arm. Guess this is it, then? Guess so. For a second, she looked like she wanted to say something else, something final, something that might take the sting out of the whole thing. But there was nothing left that could. She grabbed her bags, pulled the door open, and stepped out. She didn't look back. I didn't expect her to. I watched her car roll down the street until it was out of sight, then let out a long breath, stretching out my shoulders. It was done. Finally, completely done. Martha O'Neill was out watering her flowers. She glanced up, giving me one of those long, knowing looks. Well? I shrugged. It's over. She smirked. Over? Nah. Just a new chapter. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't an ending, just a shift. Either way, I had no plans to look back. The next morning, I was back in my office, boots up on the desk, flipping through a new case file. A missing kid, trouble at home, nothing simple, but nothing I couldn't handle. My kind of work. The kind that made sense. My phone buzzed. A text from an old contact, nothing more than a link to a news article. I clicked it, smirking as I read the headline. Devereaux disbarred, fraud charges pending. I leaned back, tapping the screen off, letting the satisfaction settle. He was finished. No coming back from this. Outside, the town kept moving, people going about their lives, business as usual. And me? I was already on to the next job. A month later, I was sitting on my porch, beer in hand, watching the sun dip low over the trees. The air smelled like cut grass and grill smoke from somewhere down the block. It was the kind of evening that reminded a man why he stuck around in a place like this. Slow, steady, no surprises. Martha O'Neill shuffled past on her evening walk, cane tapping against the pavement. She stopped at the bottom of my steps, giving me one of those looks, the kind that saw straight through you. You done yet? She asked. I took a slow pull from my bottle, rolling my shoulders. Yeah. Think so. She nodded, satisfied. Good. Time to move on, Wade. I smirked. That your professional opinion? She snorted. That's the opinion of an old woman who's seen enough men like you sit in their own mess too damn long. You did what needed doing. Now let it be. I tipped my beer toward her. Noted. She walked off, and I let her words settle in the quiet. Devereaux was gone. Finished. Disbarred, his career in ashes, his name dragged through the mud. Last I heard, he was holed up in some rental on the edge of town, his accounts frozen, his so-called friends nowhere to be found. Abigail? She left, just like she said she would. Moved in with her sister a few counties over. She called the kids, sent texts, did the bare minimum to convince herself she was still trying. They saw through it. I didn't have to say a word. Some things don't need explaining. Adams was the same as ever. Same faces, same coffee, same grease on the walls from 100 fried breakfasts. I slid onto my usual stool, nodding at the sheriff as he stirred sugar into his cup. Quiet week? I asked. Tom huffed. Quieter now that a certain lawyer ain't running his mouth all over town. I smirked. Shame, really? Guy had so much to say. Adam refilled my coffee, chuckling. Guess he just ran out of arguments. Tom took a sip, watching me over the rim of his mug. So, what now? I shrugged. Same as always. He nodded like he expected that. Had a guy come in last night. Wife took off with his kid. Don't know where she went. I exhaled through my nose, rubbing my jaw. He got anything to go on? Not much. I glanced at Tom, then at Adam, then down at my coffee. Just another job, another case, another mess to untangle. I tossed a couple bills on the counter and stood, grabbing my jacket. Guess I better get to work. Adam just shook his head. Some things don't change. I smirked as I pushed open the door, stepping out into the cool morning air. Damn right they don't.